Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of Verdant Revolution. This will be Part 30, Chapter 28, entitled Lasting Scars. Somewhere inside him, Midoriya knew that he would have to apologize to May by the end of the day. He recognized he'd gone too far, said too much. It wasn't her fault that he had reacted so poorly to the surprise. It was her fault. She hadn't warned him, of course, but objectively, it wasn't a bad way of testing unforeseen circumstances. He needed time to get his emotions in line. Images of past hostage situations kept flashing behind his eyes, and it hadn't been fair of him to take that out on May. Hadn't been fair of him to take his own failures to protect civilians out on her. Midoriya stepped back into Class 1A and began moving towards his desk, while his face maintained its carefully blank mask that he had been cultivating since the simulation. Yaoyorozu spotted him at his entrance and stood, excited. She had been wanting to speak with him about the president's program all day, especially after she had experienced the classes and found them to be lacking. Yaoyorozu found her arm wrapped in one of Jiro's earjacks, and when she turned confused to the young woman, Yaoyorozu found her wide-eyed and frowning. "If you're thinking of talking to Green, I wouldn't. It's been a while since I saw that look on his face, but he's in a foul mood." Midoriya sat down at his desk with the large duffel he had been carrying over his shoulder. Only a few of the students in the class noticed his entrance, and since he hadn't been stealthy in the slightest, he was once again struck with the feeling that they needed to pay better attention. Bakugo was being, all things considered, better than Midoriya had expected. While he snarled every time he looked at Izuku, and Midoriya could feel his eyes constantly tracking and glaring at him, he was at least not trying to blow him up. Progress of a kind, I suppose. The thumping in the hallway was the first thing that indicated the day was about to get more difficult. He had been forewarned by the president that the oaf was going to be their professor. The president hadn't quite ignored his warnings about the man, and in this specific case, Aizawa had been on his side. Unfortunately for both Midoriya and the school's unofficial vice president, Nezu had decided that giving the board its way on this one was for the best. Besides that, the man was never going to give up on Midoriya becoming his successor if he didn't find another. "I am!" The class whipped their heads around to the door, as the loud, proud, and passionate voice came from the other side of the door. "Coming through the door like a normal person." Most of the class let out an excited rumble and began muttering various comments ranging from his costume to his atmosphere. A select few had other reactions and stood out compared to their classmates. Himiko was indifferent. Sure, she knew All Might was the #1 hero, but in her mind, what was he in comparison to her own hero? Todoroki openly glared at the man in front of the class, as if he had somehow personally offended him, and Midoriya slid down deeper into his chair, rubbing at his temples and the oncoming headache he could already feel forming behind his eyes. "I teach hero basic training. It is a subject where you all will learn the basics of being a hero. Today is the first class, and while I've been cautioned to take it slow by my fellow professors, where would the excitement be? As such, let's get right into it. What we'll be doing today is none other than..." The entire class watched as the man spun around, impractical cape twirling, and revealed the card in his hand. "Combat training." Midoriya couldn't help but groan. What the actual fuck is he thinking? His groans were drowned out by the excited screeching from the rest of the class, clearly too willfully ignorant to think of the issue with having combat training on the first day. The small crackles and smell of nitroglycerin filling the air was enough to tell him who was the most excited out of the entire class. "And to go with the training are these." All Might pressed a button on the teacher's station at the front of the room and, with a small hiss, drawers containing 19 costumes slid out from the wall. Kirishima was the first to call out and question why Midoriya's costume was missing. Izuku sighed, hefting the duffel up into plain sight when the class turned in his direction. "My costume hasn't been fully approved by Powerloader yet. I'll be using basic gear, as well as a few pieces that have been approved." The changing room buzzed with chatter as the students all filed in and began to strip. Some congregated in groups, others slipped off and found their own corner. Midoriya was taking stock of what he had been allowed to bring along with him to the first exercise. "Hey, Midoriya!" Izuku quirked his eyebrow at the approaching form of Kirishima. The man was loud enough that the entire changing area had quieted down, and tuned into whatever question was about to be asked. "You said your costume wasn't approved. What did you have?" If anyone hadn't been paying attention before, they were now when Kirishima cut off mid-sentence in a choke. Izuku turned fully now to face the man. Had something happened? He couldn't imagine the boisterous young man stopping his question for no reason. When he turned and Kirishima choked again, Midoriya stopped to study him. His eyes were wide, pupils blown out in shock, and his pale face provided a stark contrast to the bright red of his hair. Midoriya followed where Kirishima and now the rest of the class was looking, and found his own scarred chest. Mentally, he swore. He had grown too used to the people around him not saying anything that he forgot how the scar tissue would look to someone unaware. Across his back and chest still lay the network of scar and burn tissue. It was getting better, certainly. The scars with their once angry, almost fresh appearance were fading to a ghostly white that Izuku knew would be gone entirely in a couple of years. They likely would have already been gone if he hadn't been pushing himself as hard as he had been for the last several years. The scars were by far the lowest priority for his body to heal. "What the hell happened to you, Midoriya? That's a handprint scarred into you." Izuku just sighed and waved it away. "They are all old scars and don't mean jack anymore. If you really want to know how they happened, then ask your other classmate Bakugo. He was the one that put them there after all." Was it petty to throw him under the bus? Absolutely. Did Midoriya particularly care? Not in the slightest. Everyone's head snapped around to stare in horror at the explosive blonde, not wanting to believe that someone in their own course could do such a thing. When he did nothing but flip them off and give his usual spiel about the worthless Deku deserving it, they grimaced and shook their heads, turning away from him. Bakugo had made his own bed and would have to overcome his past if he wanted to be a hero. Besides that, it was a quick way to shut everyone up. The headache was still there, despite the blocker he had taken for it. Mercifully for him and suffocating for everyone else, there wasn't another word as they all finished changing and stepped out into the tunnel. Midoriya stepped out several moments after everyone else, as he'd needed to arrange his gear into their respective pouches for the first time. It took him all of 3 seconds to slam a hand against his forehead in absolute disdain for his classmates' costumes. "Oh, Midoriya, you look so professional. I should have been more specific in what I wanted. It ended up as a skin-tight bodysuit." Uraraka chuckled nervously at Midoriya as she spoke, and he took a good look at her outfit. Black and skin-tight with pink trim, Uraraka had very little actual gear outside of what appeared to be a series of bands and chokers wrapped around her body. In contrast, it would appear that Midoriya was carrying everything that she wasn't. He stood tall in the grays, blacks, and whites of urban camouflage. Simple steel-toed black combat boots with the standard cargo pants and long-sleeve shirt of a soldier marked him from head to toe as meaning business. The bulletproof vest he wore held simple but effective NIJ-4 plates, and while he didn't figure he'd need them with his classmates, he felt better with it on, the weight a familiar comfort. A series of pouches rested on his vest, providing him with ample space for supplies. On his left leg rested a soft pouch with a red cross, while a drop holster sat on his right with a slim, sleek sidearm resting inside of it. 2 silver lines traced each side of his jaw, while on his arm was only a single patch, one of a black cat atop a silver moon. Not for the first, nor he suspected the last time, Midoriya sighed. "I like the idea behind the suit. Space theme, right? I'm also guessing that the bands are for pressure points. Come talk to me after the exercise, though. If the school won't fix the glaring issues, then May and I will be happy to do so. Besides, as we work with you on your quirk, it'll need changes anyway." Uraraka smiled and agreed quickly. She wasn't a prude by any means, but that didn't mean she was comfortable in what felt like a skin-tight suit a size too small. It wasn't until Midoriya zeroed in on someone behind her that she realized how many of them might have questionable designs to the engineer. Midoriya excused himself before stalking his way across the gathering area to place one of his calloused hands on the shoulder of Hagakure Toru. "Ashido Yayorozu Hagakure, All 3 of you are coming with me to the support department after today's exercises to get your costumes sorted out." Midoriya, still holding Hagakure in place by her shoulder, cut them off with his other hand. "No arguments. While there are issues with other costumes, you 3 have the most glaring issues." Ashido waved her hands in the air. "Oh, come on! There isn't anything wrong, especially with Yaomomo's. She looks great in it." Yaoyorozu blushed lightly at the pinkette's compliment, but since she appeared to second the sentiment, he shook his head. "You're right, she does look good. So do you." Both women flushed, but sensed a but coming. "But Yaoyorozu, your designer should have known better. Not only is there no need for massive unguarded holes in your costume, as there's a such thing as self-healing fabric, but there's absolutely no need for you to carry around a book." Midoriya turned now to Ashido, who was looking at him warily. Midoriya merely smirked before saying one thing. "Your costume isn't acid-proof, is it, Mina?" The lilac flush told him everything he needed to know, though he did catch her faintly muttering something about how only her shoes needed it. He leaned down into the ear of Hagakure, whispering to spare the poor woman the embarrassment. "Do I even need to explain why with you?" Midoriya felt Hagakure shake her head silently, before he let go of her very naked shoulder. Midoriya turned, satisfied with their silent concessions, and was met by Ida, who began vigorously chopping his hands in an attempt to lecture Midoriya regarding the perceived rude behavior of immediately trying to change others' costumes. Midoriya shut him up with a glare, looked him up and down, and began to speak again. "Make that 4. You're coming as well, Ida. Did the words crumple zone mean nothing to you or your damn brother?" It was All Might's interjected cough that pulled everyone's attention, and it was All Might who funneled everyone into the observation room before explaining the exercise they would be performing today. Apparently, the damn moon calf thought it would be a good idea to skip the actual training step and throw them straight into combat simulations. "The situation is that the villains have hidden a nuclear weapon somewhere in their hideout. The heroes are going to dispose of that." He's reading from a god's damn script. Midoriya couldn't help but deadpan at their utterly inept teacher as the man read from note cards to explain the exercise they would be taking part in. "The heroes need to either capture both villains or recover the bomb. The villains, meanwhile, need to either capture both heroes or defend the bomb the entire time." Oh yes, let's just ignore the scenario where the villains detonate the bomb because they know they can't beat the heroes. "Teams and opponents will be determined by drawing lots. They're being decided so haphazardly." Ida chopped his arms and attempted to question the randomization of the teams. Midoriya felt his eye twitch, but it was actually Jiro that spoke up first. "Nah, this is the only sensible part of this so far. We don't know who we'll have to team up with out in the field. It simulates that." Pride is what Midoriya felt now. It was good to know that not only was at least some of the training sinking in, but Jiro and, going by the look on her face, Himiko, had felt like this was ridiculous as well. Izuku smiled a bit, remembering the first few training sessions with the both of them. They knew firsthand why training was important before running simulations. Midoriya's smile persisted all the way through the picking of teams. Frankly, out of the class, he didn't really care who he ended up with, as long as it wasn't Bakugo. But Uraraka had been nice thus far, and he could use time to observe her quirk a bit more. His smile slid off his face, though, when he saw the first 2 teams picked for the exercise. Team A, Uraraka Ochako and Midoriya Izuku versus Ida Tenya and Bakugo Katsuki. Fuck. The first thing Midoriya did was approach All Might while shaking his head. He liked Uraraka, but after the day he'd had, he didn't need to be going against the ticking time bomb. It was when he called out to All Might that he discovered he was in for yet another surprise for the day. "Ah, young Midoriya, I'm glad you came over. I was needing to speak with you before your match." "As was I. You need to either swap me with another team or Bakugo." All Might scrunched up his eyebrows and looked at the boy confused. "I have no intention of doing that, young Midoriya. Why would you ask for it?" "I have a, bad reaction to explosions and fire. I'm generally fine, and normally I wouldn't have an issue with this matchup, but today has been trying. That's the word we'll use. I plan on talking to Hound Dog about it sometime this week." All Might shook his head but gave Midoriya a soft smile that Izuku was sure he intended to be comforting. I see. We can't always choose what enemies we go up against. I'll have to ask that you bear with it. Trust me, if things get out of control, I'll step in and stop it. So not even remotely listening to the fact that I plan on dealing with it. Fuck you too, All Might. Fuck you too. Fine, if that is what you think. I'm going to have to ask that you surrender your sidearm for this exercise. All Might began to reach for Midoriya's weapon, completely oblivious to the eye twitch or the fury sparking in his gaze. Before his hand could get halfway there, Midoriya's hand was clamped down on his forearm. Over my cold, dead fucking body, All Might. Young man, I cannot approve of you having a firearm during a first-year training exercise. I don't really give a shit of what you approve of. Snipe has already signed off on my use of training ammunition during training exercises. Young man, I don't want to do it, but if you don't turn over the firearm, I'll fail you on this lesson. Another eye twitch, and Midoriya was snarling and pulling his weapon from its holster. But rather than hand it off to All Might, he spun on his heel and handed it over to Jiro. Fine, but there's no way in hell I'm handing a loaded gun to you. We're also going to have a nice long discussion with the president and UA's resident firearms expert after this exercise. Thank you, young Midoriya. Midoriya simply walked out of the room without another word. Uraraka let out a long sigh and a bit of a pained moan. Geez, memorizing the building's floor plan is a lot of work. Important work, though. You'll never want to go into a situation without information. Though inevitable sometimes, it is still a danger to do so. Looking over, Uraraka found Midoriya working with some kind of holographic projection originating from a band on his wrist. And got it. The holograph sputtered for a second before a projection of what appeared to be the security feeds arose in the air with detailed correlation to a projected map beside it. As I said, no information is a bad thing. This'll make things easier. Uraraka shook her head, startled, and nervously stuttered out a question on the legality of his actions. Izuku merely quirked an eyebrow while he continued to study the projection. There was no rule against hacking into the security feeds, or if you're asking about the literal legal ramifications of me hacking into a UA system, then don't be. The president and I have kind of a game going on to see which of us can succeed. Can he stop me? Can I get past him? It entertains us, but regardless, I've got a plan. Interject if you feel the need. They've set up the bomb here, in this room. Izuku gestured to the map, and Uraraka simply shook her head. I've only known him for a couple of days, and already this is starting to seem normal. In all likelihood, Bakugo will abandon Ida to fend for himself and come straight for me. I pissed him off earlier by throwing him under the bus, and we have a past that he'll most certainly take this opportunity to settle. So we take him down and move on to Ida quickly, set up an ambush for Bakugo. Izuku scratched his cheek with the hand not currently projecting, thinking, and finally shook his head. If this were a real mission, I'd say yes, but the fact of the matter is that this is still a training exercise, even if All Might has screwed up royally by throwing you all in without actual training. You aren't up to fighting Bakugo yet, and that isn't disparaging you or your quirk. He's a natural fighter, and is particularly vicious. I'd like to think he wouldn't take things too far trying to get to me, but who knows? You split off from us, and I'll handle Bakugo. Ida will likely clean up the room so you can't do anything, so pick up some ammo along the way. Ida's fast. I'm not sure if I can take him in a straight-up fight. Izuku tilted his head back and forth before shaking it. You can do it. It just depends on how things go. If you need help, then just call for it on the comms and I'll come right up. I thought you just said it was a training exercise and nothing would be learned. Izuku chuckled. That I did, but knowing when to ask for help is also a good thing to know how to do. Aizawa had a bad feeling. That wasn't anything out of the ordinary, of course. He was always tired and overworked, but this particular bad feeling was because of their new professor for hero training. The man may have been fantastic as a daylight hero, and never would anyone hear him say that, but he was utterly incompetent when dealing with people. So rather than sleeping peacefully in the teacher's lounge like he wanted to be doing, Aizawa found himself slinking into the observation room after not finding the class doing any kind of basic training. If he'd had a bad feeling before, then he felt queasy when he saw what was going on. The oaf had decided to throw them into combat simulations rather than teach them to fight. The queasy feeling graduated to nausea when he saw Midoriya breaching through the front door of the building that Bakugo, of all people, was in. While he trusted Midoriya not to take a training exercise too far, he couldn't help but be worried after he'd witnessed him, a teenager at the time, practically liquefy a man against a wall for a flash grenade. He decided that he most certainly wouldn't be leaving this to All Might. Aizawa stepped forward, startling everyone in the room, including the mountain of a #1 hero. Aizawa, I wasn't aware you planned on attending the course today. Turn on the audio. But what about their privacy? Aizawa side-eyed All Might with as much derision as he could possibly muster at that moment. If the students decide to say something stupid or embarrassing while on comms during a simulation or a mission, they deserve what they get. Turn the audio on. Midoriya loved being right. Bakugo spun around the corner, roaring as he did so and clearly aiming for Midoriya. He was met with a steel-toed boot into his gut, sending him practically skipping back down the hallway. Uraraka hesitated for a moment, but nodded resolutely and started sprinting for the stairs. Izuku turned then, meeting Bakugo's glare and a snarl, with his own Cheshire smile. It doesn't matter who the fuck you are, I'm gonna beat you into the fucking ground and make you spill your guts. Izuku scrunched his brows at the comment. What the hell are you talking about, Bakugo? Oh, don't give me that bullshit. You aren't Deku. I don't know what the hell happened to him in that alley, but you aren't Midoriya Izuku. I don't know if you killed him and took his place or what. Hell, maybe you killed him in the hospital and took his place, but you sure as fuck aren't him, and that makes you a goddamn villain. It clicked into place, and Midoriya couldn't help but laugh. You think... Oh god, that's too good. You are the stupidest smart person I've ever met, Bakugo Katsuki. You are so close, and yet so fucking far, it shouldn't be funny. Bakugo lunged at him, swinging wide with his right fist. Midoriya simply sidestepped it, before smacking him on the back and sending him stumbling. You don't get to fucking make fun of me, you fuck. Because of you, the old hag spent years sending me to therapy where some worthless extra would spend fucking hours picking my goddamn brain for shitty bullshit excuses. Deku would have never done the things you did, so I'm going to fucking kill you and expose your whole plot to the world. Izuku rolled his eyes and continued deflecting, twisting here and jabbing there. Katsuki was a natural, but even with Midoriya's flinches from the explosions, he couldn't even remotely get close to landing a blow with his untrained brawler fighting style. I know you won't understand this, Bakugo, but there are more important things in life than your approval. I don't give a single shit what you think. Midoriya, I could use some help up here. Ida's too fast and I can't really do anything, even with the ammo I brought up. Ah, sure. Don't worry, I'll be right up. Izuku smirked again as Bakugo stumbled back from a knee strike to the ribs. Looks like our time is up, Bakugo. Be sure to book another session with Dr. Midoriya. I thought we were making some real progress here. Bakugo screamed and lunged for Midoriya again, using his own explosions to propel himself forward. Midoriya twisted around the blow and lashed his leg back and up to where Bakugo was attempting to maneuver over him. Izuku's foot made a clean connection with Katsuki's sternum, dropping him to the ground, gasping for breath. Izuku wasted no time in twisting Bakugo's arms behind his back and wrapping them in capture tape. Honestly, not bad, Bakugo. Need to work on the anger issues and get some proper training in you, but you might just make a half-decent hero one day. Good fight. Aizawa couldn't help but rub his temples as he watched the fight occur. What Bakugo was spouting was concerning, to say the least. He wouldn't have believed any of it if it hadn't been for Midoriya's partial admission that something else did happen in the alleyway. But outside of even that, what was more concerning was Midoriya's actions during the fight. Something wasn't right with him. The shift was right when Bakugo started throwing small-scale explosions at Midoriya. It was subtle, enough so that Aizawa barely noticed the change. Midoriya covered it well, with taunts and jeers, with little slaps and shoves, but his eyes told a different story. They'd glass over or go unfocused for just a moment. But a moment was enough for him to see it. He caught Midoriya altering several moves that, if they hadn't been altered, could have been severely debilitating, if not lethal, to his opponent. Oof. Oh, come on, Midoriya. This isn't manly at all. Just finish him off. Don't toy with the poor bastard. Kirishima was the one that finally broke the stunned silence after a particularly brutal punch to Bakugo's kidney. Aizawa was sorely tempted to admonish him, were it not for his own nerves wanting Midoriya out of the fight before he could lose a student. It was Himiko, instead, that said something while shaking her head at Kirishima. "He's not toying with him. He's trying to teach him. Watch and listen carefully. Bakugo wouldn't take constructive advice if it bit him in the ass. I've known him for all of a couple days, and I can already tell that much. Every time Midoriya dodges, he strikes Bakugo in some way, but listen to what he's saying when he taunts him. It's all designed so that that bastard can learn from it, and not think that Midoriya is teaching him something." Kirishima shook his head. "Why would he want to help his opponent? It's a competitive exercise." "There is something to be said about not giving your opponent any chance in a friendly match, Kirishima. I find it to be rather admirable that young Midoriya is going out of his way to teach during the exercise." Aizawa couldn't care less as to why and was mostly concerned with the result. He wasn't fighting seriously, and it could have very well been keeping Bakugo from becoming a meat paste. Aizawa couldn't help but feel a sense of relief when Midoriya tied Bakugo up with the capture tape, before walking away, and when All Might called Bakugo out of the exercise. The relief was short-lived when Bakugo, in his anger, snapped the capture tape. He felt his eyes nearly bug out of his head when he finally realized that the gauntlets weren't just aesthetic, and that Bakugo was pulling the damn pin on one of them. Hell let loose as Bakugo smiled like a madman. A flash was all they saw before the side of the building was blown apart by a massive gout of orange-red flame that turned the building itself into shrapnel. "You son of a bitch!" Aizawa jerked at the curse from Himiko, and it took him a moment to realize it was directed towards All Might. "You wouldn't let Izuku have his sidearm, but you fucking okayed a goddamn bomb?" Aizawa was watching the smoke clear while hoping beyond hope that everything was going to go better than his gut was telling him it would. That hope died when the smoke cleared enough to show Izuku in a crouch. The silver lining on the edge of his jaw had snapped out into a mask of some kind, covering the lower half of his face. Aizawa didn't need to see his entire face to see that he was absolutely furious. He only needed to see his eyes to realize that Midoriya was somewhere else right now. What they had thought had been rubble shifting turned out to be Midoriya growling at Bakugo. For just a split second, Aizawa held on to that hope as he reached for the microphone to call the match. That split second of hope was all he got as Midoriya blurred on camera. One moment he was almost to the end of the hallway, and the next, he was slamming his fist into Bakugo's gut. Bakugo practically doubled over from the force, retching as he went, only to be met with an armored kneecap to the face. His head snapped back, and Midoriya clapped his hands down, hard over Bakugo's ears, grabbing and pulling his head down for another knee strike to the face. Bakugo tried to swing back, tried to get Midoriya away from him long enough to get his bearings, but the attempt was futile, as Midoriya batted his arm aside and slammed Bakugo's head into the wall. Aizawa had grabbed the microphone and prepared to call the match to an immediate halt when Izuku grabbed Katsuki by the throat and slammed him into the ground with one arm, drawing his knife in the other. All Aizawa could do was scream for Midoriya to stop, as the blade veered towards Bakugo's face. Midoriya sat, straddling Bakugo's chest, panting, doing everything he could to mentally pull himself from the pit of memory, pull himself from the broken buildings and ruined structures of battlegrounds past, to wipe away the image of dead civilians because he'd been too slow to stop this goddamn bastard from killing— No, not a soldier. Bakugo, not a soldier. Bakugo's eyes were blown wide from fear and panic. Midoriya glared down at the boy who had clearly learned absolutely nothing. He wasn't worried about the man trying anything further. No, being pinned into the ground by a knife through your left ear tended to have the same effect of fear-driven paralysis. Midoriya groaned as he felt the adrenaline wearing down. His right leg had been singed in the explosion, and while most of the fabric had been blown away, he could feel the other bits that had been melted into his skin. The smell of burnt flesh had been the tipping point. The explosion was bad enough, but add in the heat, the destruction, the smell of cooking skin. He'd rushed the perceived threat without a second thought, and he had utterly fucked his muscles doing that. Oh, nothing had been obliterated like with the ball toss, but he'd moved too quickly and torn the muscles in his legs again. Then he'd blitzed Bakugo in a series of strikes that had torn the muscles in his chest and arms. It wasn't enough to stop him from moving around by any means, but he was going to be sore as hell momentarily, while his body fixed the little tears. Midoriya surveyed the hallway around him, or well, he attempted to, before realizing that the blast had been far larger than either of them had realized. Most of that floor had been practically obliterated, and the building itself was making an ominous creaking sound that didn't endear him into staying inside of it much longer. Damn it to hell. I warned All Might I shouldn't be in this match. This exercise is officially over. All of you back to the observation room now. Oh, goody, Aizawa was watching that. What else have you got for me today? What other absolute bullshit have you got for me to deal with? Izuku pulled his knife from Bakugo's ear, eliciting a small grunt of pain. Izuku rolled his eyes before standing up and getting off of Bakugo, who rolled over, coughing, and doing his best to press himself to his feet. The building creaked again, but this time there was a crunch, followed by a snap, a scream, and the building collapsed. All right, listeners, this concludes Chapter 28 of Verdant Revolution. Chapter 29 will be up next. Definitely would love to hear what you all thought about this chapter. I know that ending is definitely one that's going to kind of keep you guys on the hook here a bit. It's one that definitely forced me to keep reading. I love this chapter. I think that there's a lot of really cool components to it too. I think the fact that we get All Might's inclusion into it now, and we get to see how horrible he is as a teacher. And I swear every time I read a fanfic where they do this initial exercise of combat training and All Might runs it, and people actually call him out for the fact that they didn't get a chance to do any real training first, always makes me laugh. So let me know what you all thought about this chapter. And as always, thank you all so much for listening.